When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, we reveal how expert witnesses unlocked the secrets of unidentified bones found in Sheffield.
This was an unusual death. That death had not occurred where the package had been found by the two men.
And in Bradford, a DNA scientist examines 25-year-old evidence to solve a murder cold case.
Establishing one DNA link is useful to the inquiry team, but a number of different potential links builds a more complete case.
Sometimes forensic osteology can provide the police with critical evidence whereby a person's life has been writ on the skeleton, so to speak.
It's when you've got things in front of you and you have to interpret them, and you can see the patterns come, you can see answers coming out. That's the thrilling bit.
January 2000, Sheffield, and two men discover an abandoned sports bag on an industrial estate. Inside are human bones in layers of wrapping. Bob Story was a senior investigating officer in charge of the case.
So this location's changed somewhat since 2000 when we recovered the body. This building wasn't actually built, and this was a grass verge up the side. But the body itself was here. Well, like most police officers, I've seen several dead bodies, but none in this state of decomposition. It was almost unrecognisable as a body. It was clear that this was an unusual death. And it was also quite obvious to me that death had not occurred where the package had been found by the two men.
The level of decomposition made it impossible for the pathologist to determine a cause of death. There was just a single but inconclusive clue.
At that stage, there was a wound on the neck here, but the pathologist was unsure whether that wound was as a result of his straightening the body out or whether it was a wound that had been inflicted previously.
Police did not know how the victim died or when, and still hadn't enough evidence to even establish an identity.
The initial post-mortem was only able to give us a rough height, and that was it. So the identification from the remains of the body and what was left inside the wrappings became more and more important.
First, Bob decided to ask what more the bones could tell him, and turned to forensic osteologist and expert witness Martin Everson.
The first thing we do is start with the skull and examine certain features in the skull. We could look at the state of dental eruption. We could look at those features that can be used to assign sex and ancestry. Other than a body had been dumped in inner city Sheffield in a holdall. There was very little other information to go on at that point.
While Martin and his team began a painstaking analysis, Bob reconsidered one curious piece of evidence: a leaf found amongst the wrappings that covered the body.
The foliage that was found within the body wrappings, that was important to see if there were any clues on there. So we could build up a picture of perhaps where the body had been stored or where the body had been moved to.
To answer these questions, Bob needed the help of another expert witness. Patricia Wiltshire is an expert in analysing traces of evidence left by plant life.
If you go to a crime scene and it's predominantly one plant there, like a rhododendron, you know that if you get someone that's covered in rhododendron pollen, which is insect pollinated, probabilistically they've been somewhere where there's a rhododendron. So that's actually valuable. But more often than not, you're looking at assemblages, the groups of plants that are all growing together, and you go from there.
Bob hoped Patricia's analysis of the leaf found among the wrappings that covered the victim's body would unlock clues to where they had been murdered and when.
I got this leaf and it was yellowing. It had fallen off the tree naturally. The clues from that leaf allowed us to say that the body was probably wrapped up in the autumn. So that gives some timeline to the police.
Bear in mind the body had been discovered in January. It had obviously been concealed until the autumn of 1999, which helped us establish a time frame for the movement of the body from where it had originally been concealed.
Next, Patricia searched for clues to where the victim had been wrapped up and began by analysing the species of pollen covering the surface of the leaf.
I did palynology of this leaf, and lo and behold, what came out was a really neglected garden. And I said, the body has been near something like a clematis and a rose, and there's probably a sycamore tree there.
This information was a start, but nowhere near enough to pinpoint where the victim had been moved from or killed.
Professor Wiltshire was actually able to give us the species of plants that the foliage had come from, but they weren't unique to any particular area.
Meanwhile, however, Martin Everson's analysis of the bones was revealing clues to the victim's identity.
So in the dentition, there were signs of periodontal disease. The individual may have been chewing some sort of thing, wearing the dentition away mechanically, but also eroding or dissolving it chemically. Something like tobacco, but we had a hunch that this may have been somebody chewing cat.
Cat is a plant grown in Yemen and parts of North Africa and commonly chewed as a stimulant. Perhaps the victim was from one of these communities. Martin spotted another clue in the bones of the arm.
There was an olecranon spur, which is a little spur of bone where the triceps muscle at the back of the arm inserts into the back of the elbow, diagnostic of hand-arm vibration syndrome, which arises in people that work on vibrating mechanical equipment.
So the victim had chewed cat and worked with machinery. There were also indications of injuries and other health conditions.
There was evidence of surgical intervention in the metatarsophalangeal joints, the big toe joints. Sherman screws had been inserted to treat hallux valgus, or bunions, and there'd been a subsequent operation where one of these screws had been removed. So we had a wealth of information about this individual, but we couldn't be entirely sure what the cause was of all these changes or features.
We're building up this picture of the body and the profile of the person. We could go to hospitals and ask, did you do this operation? But But that's not quite as simple as it seems, because there were actually literally thousands and thousands of operations carried out like this across the country.
The investigation was stalling, but Martin had an idea. He asked his students at Sheffield University to reconstruct the victim's facial features based on the skull.
Facial reconstruction is really an artistic process with a limited scientific basis, but it's not usually anticipated to produce something where we might call it an exact likeness, but it might be where somebody would recognise the individual, particularly if they knew they were missing.
It was a long shot, but the investigation was running out of options. The completed model at least allowed them to appeal to the public for help.
So we went to Crime Watch and we went to the local and national newspapers with a view to getting the coverage as wide as possible. And at that stage, it really was becoming the last throw of the dice. Because if we didn't get the body identified, there was a big possibility that we would have to close the inquiry down and we'd never know what happened to this particular person.
The Crime Watch appeal produced nothing, but the appeal in the local paper did. Finally, they had a promising lead.
We got a call from a member of the public who was quite definite. It wasn't a thought. The person said, "That is Mohammed Nasser Ali. It was from Sheffield, and he hadn't been seen for about 4 years."
75-year-old Mohammed Nasser Ali had worked in a cutlery factory and was once a prominent member of the local Yemeni community.
I think when we got an ID, we felt incredibly elated, really. It felt like a fabulous success. And then the man's medical records came back, and we were able to link what we'd found on the skeleton to the man's life history.
And as the investigation unfolded, all the issues that we looked at in terms of the forensic evidence actually fitted together really well.
And we could confirm that he was born in Yemen and brought up in Yemen, and that he may well have chewed cap, had indeed had operations for the treatment of hallux valgus on both feet, and that he'd gone back to have one of the screws, the Sherman screws, removed. We also were able to learn that he'd worked in the Sheffield cutlery industry for many years as a buffer. That's somebody that polishes cutlery, and therefore it's likely that he may have got hand-arm vibration syndrome, causing his olecranon spurs, and that he may have got hallux valgus or bunions in both feet as a consequence of using the pedals on a mechanical polishing machine.
Everything pointed to the victim being Mohammed Nasser Ali. His family had never reported him missing. But when police carried out a search of his home, they found his blood in the house and in the cellar. Detectives immediately questioned his son, Hassan Nasser, and his grandson, Kassan Mohammed, and it was the grandson, Kassan, who made a chilling confession.
Because of the pressure of the investigation and where he found himself. So Kassan told us that his father had actually slit his grandfather's throat at their address at Palmer Street. And that was as a result of an argument over money.
The grandson's confession made it clear that the motive for the murder was so that his father, Hassan, could sell Mohammed's house and keep the proceeds.
And another facet of that was that Kassan and Hassan had been drawing from the grandfather's accounts and pensions throughout the 2 years that he'd been dead.
They were both charged with murder. The police had a confession, but confessions can be withdrawn. It was crucial to the prosecution to be able to prove the case forensically. So Patricia Wiltshire travelled to the victim's house. She needed to confirm that the plants in the garden there were a match for the pollen on the sycamore leaf.
And I remember going to the garden and it had been trashed. But what I did find, right next to the back door, a little tiny backyard with a back door, and right there was a clematis and a rose that had been climbing up the fence and had been cut back, but there was enough there to recognise them. And the sycamore leaf from the sycamore tree at the bottom of the garden, the clematis and the rose there, and other garden plants on that leaf clinched it, really.
Patricia's evidence also answered a question that had bothered Bob's story since the beginning of the investigation. Why had the body been moved?
In terms of the foliage that was found in the body wrappings, Pat Wiltshire had said that they'd been shed the previous autumn, and that coincided when they wanted to put the house up for sale, because they didn't want the body left there because somebody could have found it. That's when the foliage from the trees had dropped into the body wrappings, and Pat was able to identify that for us.
The corroboration of Martin and Patricia's evidence, combined with other forensics, was enough to nail the case. The two men were convicted of murder.
Both men pleaded not guilty, so it was important that all that forensic evidence that we'd collected built up the picture. The jury was left in no doubt that both men were guilty, and the basic motive for that was nothing other than greed.
Every time I do a case, I'm always surprised about the learning curve. It's still steep. You learn something every time. This is why every case is unique. I'm surprised at how much information I got from so little.
It was absolutely fascinating to find the links. The manner in which a body is disposed of, concealed, buried, will always tend to leave a trace on the skeleton.
Hassan Nasser and Kassan Mohammed were both sentenced to life in prison.
They knew that that would be a quiet area where they could throw the body out and leave it. And they never thought that because of the badly decomposed state of that body, that they would ever get found out.
From the portrayal of forensic cases on television, it can often be perceived that it's very easy to find DNA, but it's a painstaking process. You're constantly trying to get a breakthrough.
Bradford, August 1994. 86-year-old Amy Shepherd was attacked and killed at her home. The crime shocked the local community. It was a story that would catch the attention of local journalist David Jagger.
This is Follyhole Gardens, where Amy Shepherd lived for 14 years until she was killed. It's a quiet, leafy cul-de-sac. It's mainly populated by the over 60s, which is why what happened to Amy was so shocking, especially the viciousness and brutality of the killing. Amy Shepherd was an elderly lady who lived by herself. She was well known and well liked in the community. She was known locally as the Duchess because she always wore smart clothing and nice jewellery and was always well presented. A neighbour had gone round to Amy Shepherd's flat, and that was when her body was discovered. She had serious head injuries, neck injuries, stab wounds, and that was when her body was discovered and the murder investigation was launched.
When police examined the crime scene, they found jewellery and money missing. It looked like a burglary gone wrong, but there were no signs of forced entry. Detectives developed a theory to explain the crime.
It had clearly been committed by somebody who Amy trusted. He must have knocked on her door, talked her into letting him in, and it was then, while she was distracted, that he set about stealing jewellery, stealing cash, and it was only when we can assume that she discovered him, caught him red-handed, that was when he did what he did and took her life.
But police could not find enough evidence to bring charges, and for 22 years the case remained unsolved. Until, in 2016, detectives turned to forensic biologist Edward Jarman and asked him to re-examine the evidence.
The main challenge with the Amy Shepherd case was that it was decades old and samples taken hadn't revealed a potential offender. Back in the early 90s, DNA was still a useful tool, but it was far less sensitive and there were a lot more interpretational issues.
Police were hoping advances in DNA amplification and profiling since Amy's murder might now reveal a trace of her killer. But Edward did not have much to go on.
Amongst the evidence that was available to us were some tapings, a tea towel, Amy's cardigan, as well as some swabs and DNA extracts. With cold cases, obvious samples have often been tried before, so we're often left with the remnants. But unless you look, you're not going to find.
Edward's team began by examining the tapings, adhesive strips laid against evidence by crime scene investigators. The strips gather hairs, skin cells, fibres and other residues invisible to the naked eye. Edward hoped these 22-year-old samples might contain traces of DNA from Amy's killer.
One of the initial findings was a hair that had been found on the tapings taken from Amy Shepherd's neck. This is a photograph of the hair from which the root had been removed in 2009 and underwent DNA profiling then. We got the DNA extract from that sample, which we then did modern-day profiling on.
Edward's analysis revealed the first significant lead in the case in 22 years.
We never quite know what result we're going to get from a sample, but we revealed far more information that had been obtained previously and a profile that we could search the national database with.
The database showed the DNA belonged to Raymond Kay. He had been questioned at the time of the killing, when police suspected him of Amy's murder. But there was never enough evidence to make an arrest.
Raymond Kay's a career criminal. He's been in and out of prison since he was a child for all manner of crimes, mainly theft, burglary, robbery. At the time of Amy Shepherd's death, Raymond Kay was doing community service, delivering Meals on Wheels to vulnerable elderly residents, one of whom was Amy Shepherd.
A single strand of hair was not enough to prove Kay was the killer. Edward needed to find further DNA evidence. The problem was, much of the DNA recovered from the tapings was indecipherable.
Establishing one DNA link is useful to the inquiry team, but establishing a number of different potential links builds a more complete case.
All the evidence was covered in Amy's own DNA. That makes isolating a sample from the killer very difficult. So Edward used 16 years of training and a new analytical technique to focus only on the male DNA.
So it's another form of DNA analysis. I mean, it's often used when there may be a huge amount of female DNA. It allows you to target just the male DNA in the sample. So it's coming into far more routine practice with sexual assault evidence.
The process works by looking for examples of the Y chromosome, which is only found in male DNA. Edward began his search on a key piece of evidence, the murder weapon.
This was a tea towel that was thought to be used as a ligature. We had tapings from this that we undertook profiling upon.
The analysis revealed another clue.
Two of the samples suggested that Raymond Kay may have contributed a small amount of DNA.
It was still not conclusive proof Kay was the killer, but for the police, the results helped to build the case against him.
Often the public will think the DNA is the answer to all the questions, but it's more a case of trying to find a potential source of the DNA, then interpreting the results that you've established and then putting those into context within the case itself and what it actually means. Because it's often more not whose DNA it is these days, but how that came to be wherever it was located.
Edward next applied the same precision technique to identify male DNA on swabs taken from Amy's body at the time of the original investigation.
A wide profile had been established from one of the samples from Amy Sheffield, and at that time it was an unknown source. We again did some further work on those samples and established a full profile that matched Raymond Kay.
Police knew Raymond Kay was known to Amy Sheffield, that he had access to her flat, and that he had a history of violence. But for over 2 decades, this wasn't enough to charge him with her murder. Now, Edward had provided them with brand new evidence, a complete DNA profile of one of Kay's hairs found on Amy's neck, traces of his DNA on a tea towel used to strangle her, and his DNA on her body. At last, detectives could arrest Raymond Kay.
After police had matched his DNA to what was found at the crime scene, officers went to his house to interview him about the incident, and when police knocked on his door and asked him about a crime that had happened more than 20 years ago, he said, "Are you joking?" He seemed to think that this crime which he'd committed a quarter of a century ago, he was going to get away with for the rest of his life, and he was never going to face the consequences for what he'd done.
Raymond Kay was brought to trial in 2019. He was found guilty and sentenced to a minimum of 17 years for Amy's murder. The forensic evidence gathered by Edward Jarman 22 years after the crime was essential to the conviction.
As a forensic scientist, I think you have to have a lot of determination, be very thorough with your examinations, and have a good, sound understanding of the science behind it so you can present it in an objective fashion. Samples taken from a crime scene may not seem useful at the time, but may reveal their secrets decades later.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helped solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we look at how the analysis of phone text messages revealed an awful crime.
I would have been thinking them were her last words to me, and they weren't. They were his.
And we go deep inside a DNA lab to show how new technology helped to solve a decades-old murder.
We will keep doing what we can to bring the offenders before the courts, and every day we may get that breakthrough, and we may come knocking on their door. So hopefully they don't sleep easy at night.
I've spent the last 30 years or so studying language and how people use it. We all use language, but we do a lot of that unconsciously. Conversations are really quite structured, even though we just feel like we're making it up as we go along. Authorship analysis is analysing a text to try and figure out who's holding the phone, who's typing the message.
Stoke-on-Trent, 2009. There's a fire at the Burks family home. Dad Christopher and the two children escape, but Mum Amanda is later found dead in an attic bedroom. The story catches the attention of crime journalist Chris Summers.
It appeared as if her husband had rescued his two children and got them out of the house, but Amanda, who was in the attic bedroom of the house, was not able to make it out, and it just appeared like a terrible accident.
Amanda Burks had been married to Christopher for 3 years. They had a 2-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. Amanda's mum, Beverly, lived close by.
This is Amanda as a toddler playing in the back garden. She was always an happy child. She's always got a smile on her face. She'd come in the room and her smile lit the room up. Just a daughter to be really proud of.
So this is a photo that I have in my room. It's me and my mum on a holiday in Mallorca when she was pregnant with my little sister Amelia. And this one is Amelia and my mum on her 2nd birthday at one of the venues that we hired out for a party.
It was the last birthday party Amanda did for Amelia.
I've got lots of good memories of me and my mum, such as making cakes and stuff, and even just little things, getting in the car, singing along, playing music. Destiny's Child, she used to love them. And yeah, they're just some good memories I've got of my mum.
When she was 18, she bought her own house, and she was doing really well for herself. She'd always got big aspirations, what she wanted to do for the future.
Amanda was 27 when she died. It's a night her mum will never forget.
The early hours of the morning, that's when we got the knock at the door and said there was a fire. First thing I did was pick the phone up for ring Amanda. The phone rang, but no answer. So then I rang Chris's phone. That rang and no answer.
It seemed a tragic accident. Husband Christopher said Amanda had been enjoying an aromatherapy session upstairs and that a candle may have caused the fire, but detectives weren't convinced.
Staffordshire police were immediately somewhat suspicious of Christopher Burks. And as their investigation went on, there were all sorts of aspects of the investigation which suggested that his story didn't quite add up.
The body hadn't moved. She was still found on the bed, obviously very badly burned. But there was no, suggestion that she'd got up, or you would have thought she'd be by the window trying to get out.
You want answers. You want answers to why didn't she get out and everybody else did? How's it happened?
Relations between Amanda's mum and her son-in-law had always been strained. She was uneasy with the control he seemed to have over her daughter.
She met Christopher. I think she met him on a night out. I think from the beginning the relationship was volatile. She'd be out for a night out and I'd get a phone call and his staff, I've been out and picked her up, because they could be for a night out and then all of a sudden he'd turn nasty with her. She'd had him arrested, but with control and domestic violence, he can always worm your way back in. And he'd come back with all these apologies and how sorry he was. She had Jack and then she got married. We weren't really happy about her getting married, but She kept telling us as he'd changed and he doesn't... She got to some point, I don't think she told us everything what went on.
When Amanda and Christopher married, they moved further out of town, but Amanda always stayed in close contact with her mum.
He wanted to move further out, but it wasn't a matter of moving. I think what it was, he wanted to break the bond with us. But the bond with us as a family was strong. Amanda used to ring me every morning, text every day.
Beverly and Amanda were in touch by text right up to the day of the fire.
I texted Amanda on the day. I'd not heard nothing off her. She texted me back and said, I don't feel like talking at the moment. Me and Chris have been talking and he's took the children out and I'm having a nice aromatherapy bath. I'm just relaxing in the bath. And we were texting backwards and forwards at this point.
In the days that followed the fire, Beverly read and reread Amanda's final text to her time and again and began to feel something wasn't as it should be.
It was when we were looking at the taxis and I thought, these taxis don't look right. You know, we always did 3 little kisses and I remember once I was in a rush and I forgot to put the kisses on. And I got a message back, where's my 3 little kisses? So it was a kind of a thing we always did. And I think it was perhaps the next day that's, you know, we'd spoke to the police.
While Beverly began to wonder if the text had actually been sent by her daughter at all, detectives received the pathologist's report into Amanda's death.
Perhaps the clincher for the police was the toxicology report, they did on the body. And crucially, it showed that there was no signs of carbon monoxide in the body. You know, you would have thought if somebody was alive and breathing, they would be breathing in smoke, which made them, immediately think she's been murdered, or she's at least dead before the fire.
The report went further, estimating the time of death at around 12:30 lunchtime, 12 hours before the fire. But several people continued to receive texts, apparently from Amanda, over the course of the afternoon and evening. It was clear these texts would now be key to solving the case.
Messages like WhatsApp messages and text messages can form a vital part of a criminal case. And obviously the computer forensics can these days say where a phone is when a message was sent from to a certain degree of accuracy. But what they can't tell you is who's holding the phone, who's typing the message. And this is where forensic linguistics can come in.
Tim and his team at the Centre of Forensic Linguistics told police what they needed, and then they set to work.
So we asked them to collect about 3 months' worth of text messages. We ended up with about 200 messages from Amanda Burks and about 200 messages from Christopher Burks. And what you're trying to do is analyse the known messages to set up statistical patterns of usage. So what does Amanda Burks do frequently within her messages? And then distinctive from other people. So what does she do that Christopher Burks doesn't do, and vice versa?
If Tim could identify the individual texting styles of Christopher and Amanda, then he could show who really wrote the suspect messages sent after Amanda was dead. But the analysis would take weeks. Meanwhile, Amanda's children faced coming to terms with the loss of their mum.
So I've sort of been divided into 2 parts. Before my mum died and after my mum died. Like, I still struggle with the fact that I don't have my mum here anymore. And I'm still coming to terms with the fact that she isn't here anymore. You know, it still does get to me and stuff, but you never heal. You just come to live with the fact that what's happened.
The children live with us. The children have struggled massively. Even now, they still want their mum.
Tim's analysis was now beginning to reveal crucial differences in the language and spelling used by Christopher and Amanda when they texted.
From the collection of text messages, we were able to identify those features that are consistent within Amanda Burks's messages and distinctive from Christopher Burks. And what we're able to do is whittle this down to a set of 18 features. For some of those features, she would be the only one to use those features, and for some features, Christopher Burks was the only one to use those features. So the feature examples I've got are, for example, the use of digits as a syllable substitute were a Christopher Burks feature. And there are other features which were mostly Christopher Burks. So the use of commas, for example, was something that was very rare for Amanda Burks to use, but Christopher Burks did use commas. Some features, it was about alternate spellings. So the word with, Christopher Burks was the only one to use the spelling W-I-V for with.
Tim was now able to use these findings to analyse each of the texts sent from Amanda's phone on the day she died and reveal who had written them.
At about 11:40, we get a message that contains the 4 with the digit 4, and that's a strongly Christopher Burks feature. A little bit after that, at 12:07, there's another message which has a set of commas in, which are mostly a Christopher Burks feature. Then we get to a message at 12:39, around 12:40, where suddenly we get a message which has 3 features which are more likely to be Christopher Burks than Amanda Burks. So there's the spelling of with, W-I-V, there's the use of commas, and there's the use, as a single word, for me, with the digit 4. And those are all strongly Christopher Burks features.
Tim's linguistic evidence showed it was in fact Christopher sending texts from Amanda's phone throughout the day she died.
It was him texting us. He'd had control of Amanda's phone. Amanda died at roughly about 12:30 in the afternoon, and he'd had Amanda's phone. So anybody who contacted Amanda on the phone, he was texting as if he was Amanda.
The pathologist's report showed Amanda died before the fire, and now forensic linguistics showed Christopher Burks used her phone to send texts to make it look like she was still alive.
So it was confirmatory evidence to what the police believed already, but it helped build the case, and that case was strong enough that when the different forms of evidence were presented to Christopher Burks, he actually pleaded guilty on the morning that the trial was to have started.
After years of violence and abuse, Christopher Burks killed our lovely daughter Amanda. He then showed how cruel and heartless he was by telling a continual stream of lies to everyone he spoke to, including his own children, her friends, and the police and us.
Well, the forensic linguistics was a very telling clue about Christopher Burks, because it showed that he hadn't just killed in the heat of passion. He'd killed her, and then he'd set about this trail of deceit, all these text messages to portray that she was still alive. Then he'd set this fire. Then he'd taken his children out of a burning house. It was all very cold-blooded. What lengths would he go to get away with murder?
You're clinging on to what was the last thing we said together. I would have been thinking them were her last words to me, and they weren't. They were his. How can anybody do that to a parent? Making out as everything's fine, knowing what they've done.
Because most of our cases are murder cases or violence against a person.
The moment they said his name, I knew who he was. I thought, wow, yeah, he's going to be the man.
Windsor, 1981. Pete Byrne is just beginning his career as a junior detective when he's called in to help on a major case, the murder of Claire Walterton.
Claire was 17 years old at the time of her death, a young girl with everything to live for. Just on the face of it, appeared to be a normal, happy girl, just starting her life. She went out on this particular Thursday evening and didn't come home. The body was found just before, around about 6 a.m. A guy was walking towards the railway station to catch a train into London. He saw what he thought initially was a mannequin on the footpath here, but on closer inspection, unfortunately, it wasn't.
At this point, nobody knew who the young woman was. The body was partially naked with multiple knife wounds and a cut to the throat. Police were in no doubt that this was a murder investigation. It was led by Pete's superior officer, Detective Superintendent Ken Linney.
Does her description match anyone that's been reported missing in this area?
Not at this stage, and extensive inquiries are going on to see what missing persons there are of this description.
Is it your belief at this stage that the crime, the murder, actually happened there?
No, I am of the opinion that the crime happened elsewhere.
35 miles away in the Ealing area of West London, the parents of Claire Walterton were wondering why their 17-year-old daughter had not come home.
Obviously, Mum was concerned when she got up the next day and saw that Claire's bed hadn't been slept in. Was worried throughout the day, made contact with work. She hadn't turned up for work, and saw a news broadcast that evening about the body that had been found in Windsor. They made contact with their local police, and unfortunately, it was the case that that body was Claire.
The last sighting of Claire was at an arcade where she worked. That evening she left and had begun to walk home.
At this stage in the inquiry, we have not been able to establish where she went from that time until she was found at 6:14 in the morning on the Friday.
How would you describe the man or the person who did this crime?
I describe him as a very sadistic type of person, somebody who could strike again.
The police knew the identity of the victim, but still had no suspects. An investigation team of over 50 officers, including Pete Byrne, began one of the UK's biggest manhunts. The investigation generated thousands of lines of inquiry, which in 1981 all had to be collated by hand.
What we've got here is pictures of the old incident room in West London, and it shows you drawers full of cards. It was pre-computers, so everything was written down and cross-referenced. So before too long, you had many thousands of cards. In the end, we had in the region of 250,000 cards, various files that were used, and then photographs. These top ones are pictures of Claire.
Despite the vast scale of the investigation, detectives had little proof of Claire's final moments and only a theory as to how her body was left here.
So somebody parking a car here at night in the darkness potentially would know they're close to the river. We think that he may have pushed the body over the wall thinking that she was going to go into the river.
Meanwhile, detectives did what they could to collect as much forensic evidence as possible.
And whilst Claire's body was in situ, they took tapings from the body, and this was a process where large pieces of sellotape are just placed on the body and moved up the body. And the purpose of that was, back in 1981, was to see whether there were any fibres or debris on the body, in the hope that in a day or two someone would be arrested and we could match fibres from their clothing to her body. Those tapings were then stored within the archives of the Forensic Science Service for over 30 years. What this bag contains, and unfortunately I can't open it because it's sealed, and it's sealed in a tamper-proof bag, is some of the tapings. You'll see red or pink circles, possibility that the cellular material is there. Nobody was ever arrested and linked to Claire's body, so these tapings just remained in an archive.
Over the next 30 years, experts developed brand new ways to analyse evidence, and in 2011, Pete brought in forensic biologist Edward Jarman to begin the hunt for clues to Claire's killer, all over again.
I think it does take a sort of dogged determination to work in cold cases, because often you have very limited material available to you.
Edward began by re-examining the tapings carefully kept in storage for 3 decades.
We had other samples, but this was the one of particular interest. The taping itself It's got lots of debris held on it. It includes what looks like bits of grit. Some bits would look like cellular material, as well as fibres and hairs, and possible traces of blood. It was just one strip. It was about that sort of size.
With just a tiny square of taping to work with, Edward hoped to find enough DNA to build a profile of Claire's killer.
Useful forensic samples in cold cases are often not going to be large bloodstains, for example. It's often going to be just traces of DNA, and it takes determination to find those samples and submit them for profiling and then evaluate them.
While Edward and his team carried out their painstaking analysis, Detective Pete Byrne was hoping for a breakthrough in a case that had dogged his entire career.
I knew that other cases had been successful using body tapings, so I knew that there was the potential to get something from them.
Pete did not want to end his time in the police without putting Claire's killer behind bars.
Any old detective that I ever speak to, they always talk about the cases that they were unsuccessful in detecting. But I did think about Claire and her case, and say, as did other officers that I met and spoke to.
Finally, after 4 months, Edward's team had found the evidence they were looking for, a man's DNA, discovered on a taping from Claire's body.
I mean, it's hugely significant when you can tell an inquiry team that you've established potentially a significant link, because then they can pursue it from the police side, and then following that we can discuss how to progress the case. With the result that we obtained from the tapings from Claire Waterton's body, we were confident that we were going to establish quite a high statistical value in relation to that finding. The highest level of support would be in excess of 1 billion times more likely had the DNA come from that individual as opposed to an unrelated individual.
We get this call to say that they had a profile and they were going to launch that against the National DNA Database. The moment they said his name, I knew who he was.
The DNA belonged to Colin Campbell. He was already imprisoned for the murder of Deirdre Sainsbury in 1984. Just like Claire, she disappeared from West London and her body found dumped a few miles away. In November 2012, Campbell was brought in for questioning. Police were now face to face with the man they believed killed Claire Waterton.
I wasn't averse to being friendly with the lady.
Yeah.
I may well have known a series of ladies.
Okay.
Claire may have been one of them.
But Colin Campbell insisted he didn't recognise Claire.
She looks like any girl I may have played hockey with. She looks like any girl I may have met through work.
Okay.
Actually, she looks like a happy person, and I'm glad about that. No, I don't recognise.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's not to say I never ever knew her. I just don't remember her.
Campbell never confessed, but the forensic evidence was enough for the case to go to trial. Again, this time, in front of a jury, Campbell claimed he was innocent.
The only evidence that Campbell gave was his own, and he basically said, whilst he couldn't remember meeting Claire, he lived in that particular area, he may have gone into the amusement arcade where she'd been that evening, and it's possible that she may have sat on his knee. That was his defence.
But the DNA evidence recovered by Edward Jarman from body tapings could not have come from the minimal contact Campbell described. On the 4th of December 2013, 32 years after Claire's body was found, Colin Campbell was convicted of her murder.
Ed and the rest of the Eurofins team, obviously we wouldn't have been in a position to get that incredibly compelling evidence to put before the jury to say that Colin Campbell's DNA was on Claire's naked body.
You want to help it come to a successful conclusion. That's why you are a sort of forensic scientist. You want to contribute in a constructive fashion. So we're always pleased if our evidence has contributed to a successful conclusion of a case.
Thanks to the work of an expert witness, the case that Pete Byrne had begun his career with was now closed.
It was one of the highlights of my career to be able to say that 32 years later we got a result. But it's also important to send a message out to other families of lost people that we do not forget and that we will keep doing what we can to try and bring the offenders before the courts. And every day we may get that breakthrough and we may come knocking on their door. So hopefully they don't sleep easy at night.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd have the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, how the work of two expert witnesses proved crucial in solving the notorious murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman.
They used the media very effectively, so it was on every single TV programme. Everybody, I think, was holding their breaths and praying that they would be found alive and well.
And how advances in forensic science allowed one expert witness to identify the killer in a murder cold case.
It was one of the first major examples of DNA cracking a cold case, 16 years on from the murder.
When we use forensic geology, we look at the details of the rock and often the soil that's involved in the case. There are quite a number of techniques we can use that enables us to produce a really unique result that will match a suspect to a crime scene.
When I go to a crime scene, it's everything. It's the soil itself, the vegetation, the amount of light, the creepy crawlies that are there. It all builds up to a picture, and one can get an enormous amount of information for the police.
August 2002, Cambridgeshire. Two young girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, are reported missing from a family barbecue. Like many of us, crime journalist Ron K. Phillips still remembers the case 20 years later.
Once their families realised they were missing and they'd been reported to the police, there was a really intensive search to find them. And they used the media very effectively, so it was on every single TV programme. Local people joined the hunt. It really, everybody, I think, felt and was holding their breaths and praying that they would be found alive and well.
This evening there were countless volunteers assembled outside the girls' school.
An image taken the very day Holly and Jessica went missing now filled TV screens across the country.
The thing that's incredibly poignant is the photograph was taken just hours before they went missing. They were at a family barbecue having a wonderful time, and a few hours later, well, you know what happened.
Former Assistant Chief Constable Alan Mains conducted a review of the case for Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Service. He studied every detail of the hunt for Holly and Jessica.
The team on the ground were overwhelmed, I think, by the media attention. They need to get the message out, and as an investigator, we would use the media quite a bit to get our message out, to get sort of appeals out, and it's been very, very productive. So, but there's a balance to that, and the world descended onto Soame over the next couple of days after the 4th of August. And that was hard to manage. It really is, sort of first 4 to 6 hours is your golden opportunity to get them back safely. When it sort of goes beyond that, then you really do have to start working through the worst case scenario.
Less than 2 weeks later, the girls' bodies were discovered by walkers in woodland 20 miles from their home.
It was the news the nation had been dreading. The discovery of 2 bodies in thick woodland next to the RAF base at Lakenheath.
In the interim between the girls going missing and the recovery of their bodies, the investigation team had really pulled together a core group of experts, and even that, they were bringing a lot of value to the team. They were starting to make sure that the information that they were getting was properly assembled.
Forensic ecologist Patricia Wiltshire was among that team and attended the crime scene.
When I got there, lots of people, lots of police officers, lots of people dressed up in white, with the press in adjacent fields with their cherry pickers. You feel very exposed, but it wasn't very pleasant. But of course, the crime scene is critically important. That's where you're going to pick up clues as to who's been there. So you have to take your time. The police wanted to know when the girls had been put into the ditch. Well, at a quick look at the vegetation that had obviously been, I found the path, it had been trampled. I could see what had happened. But of course, that's not good enough. You really need to corroborate that.
For Patricia, trampled nettles found at the scene of the crime were key to calculating when the bodies were left there. So she designed an innovative experiment.
We set up a scenario at a local field centre where they were in a very protected place where there were banks of nettles, and the warden actually walked in with heavy weight on his back twice. And then he photographed those nettles every day. And we watched their recovery. And they behaved exactly as the nettles did at the site. And after about 12.5 days, we got the same number of nodes, the same sort of distances between the nodes. So I said to the police, that confirms it's about 2 weeks. And they were shocked because it was exactly 12.5 days that the girls had disappeared and then they were found.
Patricia's experiment showed the girls' bodies had been placed there shortly after they'd gone missing. Meanwhile, the investigation had identified a prime suspect, Ian Huntley.
Whenever the police are at the early stages of an investigation, they rule nothing in or nothing out. So everybody potentially is a suspect until they are no longer. And that's the way you have to have an open mind. I think Huntley became very much to the fore in a lot of the media, and indeed in the searches as well. He was putting himself up there as somebody who was trying to help.
28-year-old Ian Huntley was a caretaker at the local school. His manner with the detectives and inquisitiveness about the case caught the attention of the investigation.
One of the community safety police officers came in to work. Huntley came up and started to chat to her. She was very, very good to sort of suss and think, you know, that's a bit suspicious, asking about how long does DNA last for. And she reported it back into the command and control, and somebody there sensed that That's suspicious. And then started to escalate from there.
Police interviewed Huntley. He lived nearby and said he had spoken to the girls the day they had disappeared. Detectives searched his home.
Police officers noted a strong smell of cleaning substance, and that automatically pulled your suspicions right up there. And the washing on the line, when it was raining, all the things that people wouldn't do in the ordinary course of their everyday events. And this was something that they had to look at closer.
Police began a forensic investigation of Huntley's house and his car. In both, they discovered red fibres matching the football shirts worn by Holly and Jessica when they disappeared. But Huntley had an explanation.
He then comes up with this story that they came in with a nosebleed. And that's all, that's very credible in the sense, and it happens. And the fact that he was at the school, there might have been a common bond, known them and been familiar, and more importantly, been at ease with them. It's the investigators that have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, not Mr. Huntley. It's like a strand on a rope. The more strands you can get, the thicker the rope is, and the more evidence that you would gain to bring it before a court and before a jury. And therefore, if you were just taking it on fibre evidence, you would have to really make sure that whatever he said is rebutted.
Detectives continued their hunt for more evidence. They searched the school where Huntley worked and found some upsetting evidence. Patricia Wiltshire analysed the football shirts for clues to how they got there.
All embedded in that clothing were bits of vegetation, particularly the fruits of alder trees that were hanging over that ditch very densely. And so the alder fruits and other things told me straight away that the girls had been clothed when they were in the ditch.
The red fibres at his house and the football shirts at his place of work were incriminating evidence against Huntley. But neither placed him at the location where the bodies had been hidden. For that, police turned to expert witness and forensic geologist Andrew Moncrief.
If you don't have any evidence linking a suspect to a murder victim after they've been killed, then you've not really got that all-important link, because contact while they're still alive can be explained in all sorts of ways, as it could in this case. And you really do need that link very often with the body deposition site.
Police had possession of Ian Huntley's car. Now they asked Andrew to look for evidence that could link it to the crime scene.
I did what I would always do, which is first of all to go to the site in question and see what's there. As I walked down the track and started digging a trial pit down through it, I really did get quite excited, because I could see that we were dealing, amongst many other things, with chalk. And chalk is extremely valuable forensically. Chalk itself is very widespread in the British Isles, one of the most common rocks on the surface. And the lovely thing about it is it contains millions upon millions of very, very tiny fossils. And those fossils have been used extensively to date the rock very, very accurately. So you know exactly where you are within the chalk.
Andrew took samples of the chalk for analysis and then turned to Huntley's car. If it had traces of chalk matching the location where the girls' bodies were found, then Andrew could place Huntley at the scene of the crime.
You can find geological samples all over a car. You'll obviously find material on the tyres, very often sprayed up onto the wheel arch, maybe up the side if a car's been stuck in a muddy area. The problem with all of those things is that they are not one-off events. The wheel arch of a car will have material in it from hundreds of miles of driving. Likewise, if you find a fragment of rock lodged in a tread of a tyre, how do you know where it came from? It could have been picked up from almost anywhere. The beauty about the deposits that I found on Ian Huntley's car was where they were. They were lying on the top of the front left suspension arm. Now, that's not a place where you would commonly find material lodged. It had to have been picked up in a single event by the car being driven over a pile of rocky soil and taking the top off, a bit like a boiled egg, if you like. So it represented a single event. We had a sample uncontaminated by any other locality. It had got in the car on one occasion, and one occasion only, and that made it very powerful.
Andrew sent the chalk samples from the car and the crime scene for analysis.
Lo and behold, in very short order, back came the results. They were all exactly the same.
But Andrew needed to go even further and prove beyond doubt that there was nowhere else Huntley's car could have picked up chalk matching the crime scene.
The last thing you need to do in this sort of exercise is often what we call control sampling. You have to go out and actively look to see if you can't find this stuff somewhere else. We know it can't have come from further south than Cambridge because it was the wrong type of chalk, it was the wrong colour, the wrong hardness. We know it can't have come from north of King's Lynn, once again, wrong type of rock. Now, because the area is so low-lying and chalk is so soft, almost all of that is covered by fields, forests, roads, whatever. You don't see a lot of chalk outcropping when you drive around East Anglia. So really you're looking for places where it's been dug up, and that means ditches, quarries, things like that.
Andrew and his team analysed chalk samples from dozens of such sites and even considered which were accessible in a Ford Fiesta. But they concluded the only possible match was the site where the bodies were found. Police now had evidence tying Huntley to the crime scene.
First of all, a bit mind-blowing to the investigation team to prove absolutely beyond doubt that that's what it was in terms of the chalk and to the site and whatever else. That's just fantastic work. It really is fantastic, and it just illustrates the very important part that the scientists play.
Detectives charged Huntley with the double murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. His trial began in November 2003 at the Old Bailey in London.
The trial, just like the search for the girls, attracted not just nationwide attention, but worldwide attention. Everybody just holding their breath and wanting to know what the outcome would be.
You go up in there and you take the oath, or you affirm, or whatever it is, and you look up. And there's all these journalists whose faces you recognise from the television. And it takes quite a moment to settle down and to think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it.
Both Andrew and Patricia explained their evidence to the court. It had an immediate effect on the trial.
Just after we'd given our evidence, the barrister stood up and said, "My client wishes to confess."
Following Huntley's last-minute guilty plea, he was sentenced to life in prison to serve a minimum of 40 years.
I am proud that it made a difference. I think it's probably true that the geological work on the investigation was important. Forensic geology doesn't work well that often. But if it was going to ever work, I'm so glad it worked well on that case.
Roy Green is a forensic scientist who specialises in using DNA to solve cold cases, but it's not always like you see in the movies.
Yeah, because of programs like CSI, people seem to think that there's the DNA and you can just test it and you know, yeah, it's his, and case solved. It's so much more complicated than that.
(1983) Merseyside. 50-year-old Cynthia Wiltshire is discovered face down in her bath at her home in Heswall on the Wirral. Cynthia was a divorced mother of one who worked as a beautician. The press quickly dubbed the murder the Beauty in the Bath. Local crime journalist Mark Thomas covered the case as a young reporter.
Cynthia Wiltshire worked as a beautician at a fairly exclusive department store called Brown's in Chester. She had a fairly sort of glamorous background, and she also had quite an active social life to go with it, as was to emerge during the case.
Cynthia was living alone at this house in Heswall in 1983.
Cynthia's body was discovered by her sister and brother-in-law when they went to visit her, were surprised to find that there was no answer. They went into the house and unfortunately found her body lying naked, face down, in the bath. This is Buffs Lane, Heswell, which is the scene of the murder. This is a fairly affluent, quite well-off area, sort of a leafy little suburb. It was not the kind of neighbourhood that really one associates with violent crime, and it came as quite a disturbing thing to happen in such a quiet community.
Police searched the house and recovered nightwear along with Cynthia's personal diary.
Cynthia's diary contained the names of over 200 men and details of the relationships that she'd had with them. So it provided a huge resource in terms of potential clues, and in some ways that presented, of course, a massive challenge because it meant that all of these people had to be contacted and eliminated from the inquiry. It was one of the largest scale murder investigations that Merseyside police had ever done at the time. There were upwards of 100 officers actively engaged on it. They actually had a squad of detectives who became known as the Boyfriend Squad, whose job was only to go and interview all the various boyfriends that Cynthia had to try and establish whether they had alibis for the night of the murder.
Detectives had hundreds of suspects, but one by one, they were eliminated and the case went cold. For the next 15 years, Merseyside police made annual appeals for information about Cynthia's murder, but got nowhere. Then, in 1998, advances in forensic science offered detectives new hope when they turned to expert witness Roy Green.
In 1983, DNA profiling hadn't been invented yet, but 15 years later, when I picked up this case, it certainly was. And so the main thrust of the examinations was to try and find something that might produce a profile which might have come from the offender.
The pathologist's report showed Cynthia had had sexual contact very soon before she died, and the original investigation had found a mark on Cynthia's nightwear. Detectives were convinced it had come from her killer, but could not reveal an identity.
They'd found some staining on the negligee and had carried out grouping tests, but it really hadn't been that informative. And the thinking was that really there wasn't anything left.
Now, Roy wanted to use modern DNA analysis to try to identify the killer. But there was a problem. The sample no longer existed.
Now, that item had been examined for semen. During that process, they'd found a stain and cut it out, which is part of the normal forensic process at that time. And that had then been tested. But it wasn't there anymore.
Roy needed to think of a way to retrieve a new sample from the nightwear.
Part of the process for finding that body fluid is to wet the item with a spray and then apply blotting paper that's damp. The idea is you're looking for a chemical that's present in high quantities in that body fluid, and it's very hard water soluble, and it soaks into the blotting paper, and then when you spray it, it'll turn purple if that particular body fluid is there.
Roy considered the fabric around the edge of the hole left when the earlier sample was removed. Could this have absorbed some of the fluid needed to run a DNA test?
What we did was we cut around the hole and then put that in for profiling.
Despite the fact 15 years had passed and the original sample was missing, the process returned a profile.
Well, we were quite pleased we got a profile, but of course it didn't match anyone so, at the time. But that sparked the police into making a press appeal. Could anybody who knows anything about this case come forward and help them? Because they did have new evidence that might help solve it.
This time, the public appeal delivered a major breakthrough. One of the men mentioned in Cynthia's diary was John Taft, the director of a double glazing company. He'd been interviewed by police, but was ruled out as he had an alibi provided by his wife. Now, she was ready to provide new information.
The key witness who came forward was Barbara Taft, who by that point was Taft's ex-wife. They had split up by then and got divorced. She had been asked by her husband to basically provide him with an alibi for the night of the murder. He had told her that he had been at the house to do an unofficial double glazing job for her, but was worried that if he came forward and told the police that, then he would immediately become a suspect just because of him having been in the house on the day. In fact, and it may be a little bit of an omission in the investigation at the time, Barbara was never questioned by the police, so never got to make that decision of whether to tell the truth, or which was in fact that she'd been away at the time, or whether to back her husband's story. It was a huge breakthrough because suddenly Merseyside police had somebody who had definitely been at the house on the night when Cynthia was murdered, which was, you know, in itself a large step forward. So he instantly became a person of very significant interest to the investigation.
Police re-interviewed Taft. He maintained his innocence and even volunteered a DNA sample.
When we got the DNA result back from the negligee, the statistic it gave was 680,000 times more likely if that DNA had come from John Taft rather than someone related to him. But about that time, we were going to use a new DNA system, and we applied that system to a bit more of the extract, and the probability of that result was 160 million times. So the finding was 160 million times more likely if that DNA had come from John Taft rather than someone unrelated to him.
It was a huge breakthrough, and it was one of the first major examples of DNA cracking a cold case. 16 years on from the murder, here we suddenly had science providing an absolutely essential piece of evidence that was to lead to the conviction of a killer.
John Taft's alibi had been a fake, and his DNA had been detected at the scene of the crime. He was arrested and charged with Cynthia's murder.
The trial lasted for 10 days. Taft protested his innocence throughout. When he got to give his evidence, he did admit that he had been at Cynthia's house and that he had made love to her, which is something that he had not admitted for the full 16 years previously. His account was that when he left the house, she was alive and well.
I gave evidence in this case, and it was important to get across to the jury that the result we'd got was from semen, and that it was on an item that was at the scene of the crime, and therefore it was relevant, very relevant.
The jury were convinced by Roy's evidence. They found Taft guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
I think the jury got that one right. You do realise that whenever you provide a statement that it's just a small part of what the jury will hear, but in this particular case it was a pretty important evidence.